August 1988, Grayson County, Virginia. The air was thick with the memory of heat, a heavy blanket that had smothered the hollows and ridges for 74 consecutive days. The sun had baked the clay soil into a pale, cracked plate. The creeks, which should have been whispering over stones, were silent, their beds a mosaic of dry gray rock and brittle, curled leaves. The corn in the bottomland fields was not just withered. Its stalks were bleached the color of bone, and the tassels hung down like frayed rope. It was a summer that felt final, a season of closure. Silas Blackwood stood on the rise of land that separated his small pasture from the county road. He was 68 years old, a man shaped by the land he stood upon. His hands were thick, the knuckles swollen like river stones, the skin cross-hatched with a lifetime of work. His face was a map of the same sun and wind that had sculpted the surrounding hills. He did not look at the sky, which was a hazy, unforgiving sheet of white. He looked at the ground. He looked at the gully. The gully was the farm's oldest problem. It began near the woodline on the upper slope, a modest depression in the earth, but by the time it reached the edge of his best pasture, it had carved a deep, jagged wound into the land. It was 10 feet deep in places, 20 feet wide, a raw channel of exposed subsoil and tumbled rock. Every few years, a summer thunderstorm would stall over the mountain, and the gully would become a short-lived, violent river, tearing away another few inches, another few feet of the pasture his father had cleared by hand. This year, the threat felt different. The prolonged drought had made the ground impervious. It could no longer drink. When the rain finally came, and the old men at the co-op swore it would come with a vengeance, the water would not soak in. It would sheet off the baked earth, gathering speed and power, and it would all pour into the mouth of that gully. Silas could feel it in the deep quiet of the afternoon, the same way he could feel the coming of winter in the angle of the late autumn light. A reckoning was gathering. The history of the gully was a history of failure. In the 50s, the county had tried to solve it. They had brought in a bulldozer and graded the banks, making them less steep. The first heavy rain had simply carved them out again, leaving them steeper than before. In the 70s, his neighbor, Franklin Hayes, whose land lay just downstream, had built a high earthen berm to divert the flow. The water had backed up, breached the berm in a new spot, and flooded Franklin's tobacco patch with a foot of mud and gravel. After that, people mostly gave up. The gully was accepted as a feature of the landscape, a permanent and malevolent tax on anyone who tried to farm the bottomland. It was, as the men at the feed store said, just the way things were. A week prior, a new kind of effort had arrived in a clean, county-issued Ford Ranger. His name was Robert Jennings, a young man from the state extension office. He was in his late 20s, with a crisp shirt, a clipboard, and an air of untroubled confidence. He had a degree in soil science from a university where the land was flat and the problems were solved with formulas on a chalkboard. Jennings had walked the edge of the gully with Silas, his new work boots slipping on the dry clay. He took measurements. He dug a small hole with a hand auger and studied the soil profile. He made notes on his clipboard. He spoke of things like fluvial geomorphology and non-point source pollution. Silas listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the rocks at the bottom of the ravine. After an hour, Jennings delivered his assessment. "Well, Mr. Blackwood," he had said, his tone a careful blend of professional sympathy and objective distance. "The issue here is severe soil compaction on the upper slopes combined with a highly erodible substrate." He pointed his pen toward the raw, exposed earth. "Frankly, this gully is a textbook example of advanced headcut erosion. It's reached a state of critical degradation." Silas nodded slowly. He had other names for it. He called it the Big Wash. He called it the Land Eater. Jennings flipped a page on his clipboard. "The county has a new cost-share program for erosion control, but I have to be honest with you. The approved solutions for a problem of this magnitude are substantial." He described the plan: bringing in heavy machinery, grading the entire 20-acre watershed, installing a series of buried drainage pipes and rock-lined spillways. It would cost, by his estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000. The county might cover half. Silas looked from the gully to his small, neat farmhouse, then to the barn with its faded but sound tin roof. He had not had a bank loan since 1962, when he bought his Ford Jubilee tractor. The idea of $20,000 of debt was as alien to him as the moon. He said nothing. Jennings seemed to understand. It's a lot, I know. And for a pasture of this size, the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work out. I'm afraid I can't recommend it for the program. He offered a tight, apologetic smile. My official recommendation for this parcel will be to reclassify it as marginal land. Maybe plant it in pines. In 20 years, you'll have a harvestable timber crop. It was then that Jennings noticed what Silas had been doing. Along the lip of the gully, arranged in a neat but seemingly random line, were several dozen large field stones. Silas had been clearing them from the far side of the pasture, one by one, with his old tractor and a stone boat. Clearing some rock? Jennings asked, his tone shifting to one of mild amusement. Thinking of building a wall, Silas said. His voice was low and gravelly, used to long periods of silence. Jennings looked at the immense gully, then at the modest pile of stones. He let out a short, soft laugh, catching himself before it became openly disrespectful. A stone wall? Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, you'd need a wall the size of a dam to stop the kind of water that comes through here. A little dry stack fence isn't going to do anything but get washed away with the rest of it. He shook his head, a gesture of pity. It's a waste of time. Good exercise, I suppose. He clicked his pen, made a final note, and promised to mail Silas a copy of his official report. Then he got in his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of pale dust hanging in the still air. The conversation at the co-op a few days later followed a predictable course. Silas was there to buy a bag of feed for his chickens, and he heard his name mentioned by a group of men gathered near the counter. It was Franklin Hayes, his downstream neighbor, who was speaking. Saw old Silas out there again this morning, Franklin said, loud enough for Silas to hear. Stacking rocks like a boy building a fort. I swear, the heat's gotten to him. Another man, Dale Pritchard, who farmed the land across the road, chimed in. That young fella from the county was by my place. Said he told Silas the same thing. Said that gully's a lost cause. Told him to plant it in pines. There were murmurs of agreement. They were not cruel men. They had known Silas his whole life. They respected him as a man who paid his debts and kept his fences mended. But they saw his new project as a sign of decline, a stubborn old man's refusal to accept the inevitable. They saw it as folly, a quiet, harmless madness brought on by age and a hot summer. They pitied him. Silas picked up his bag of feed, nodded a silent greeting, and left. He did not feel the need to explain himself. The work was the only explanation that mattered. That evening, as the sun finally dipped below the western ridge, painting the hazy sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange, Silas did not go out to his workshop. He did not sit on his porch. He went into the small room at the back of the house that had once been his father's office. The air in the room was still and smelled of old paper and dry wood. He opened the bottom drawer of a heavy oak desk and took out a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn smooth, the corners rounded from decades of use. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, a dense, angular script that recorded the life of the farm from 1928 to 1971. It was a record of crop yields, cattle prices, weather patterns, and expenses. But it was more than that. It was a repository of knowledge. Silas turned to a section near the back, to a series of entries from the summer of 1936. It had been another year of drought followed by flood. He found the page he was looking for. It was not a memory he needed to consult. It was a memory he wished to inhabit again, to feel its certainty. The narrative in his mind shifted, the quiet farmhouse dissolving into the bright, sharp sunlight of 50 years earlier. He was a boy of 18, strong and full of the easy confidence of youth. He was walking the gully with his father, Thomas Blackwood. His father was not a tall man, but he moved with a kind of dense, rooted authority, as if he were as much a part of the landscape as the oak trees on the ridge. They had stood on the same rise of land where Silas now stood, looking at the same wound in the earth, freshly torn by a recent storm. The boy Silas had been angry. He had seen the flood as an enemy, a thief that had stolen their precious topsoil. "We have to stop it," the young Silas had said, his voice full of frustration. "We need to build a dam. Block it off." His father had remained silent for a long time, his gaze sweeping from the top of the mountain down to the creek at the bottom of the valley. He seemed to be listening to something the boy could not hear. Finally, he had knelt down and picked up a handful of the damp, gravelly soil from the gully's edge. He let it run through his fingers. "You can't stop water, son," Thomas had said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not this water. It comes from the mountain. It has the weight of the whole ridge behind it. Trying to stop it is like trying to stop an avalanche with a fence post. You'll just make it angry." He stood up and pointed not at the gully, but at the shape of the land around it. "The water wants a path. It will always find one. For 100 years, it was happy with a shallow little draw, a place where the grass grew thick. But then we cleared the timber up high, and the ground got harder, and the water got faster. It forgot its manners." He looked his son in the eye. His expression was not one of defeat, but of deep, patient understanding. It was the look of a man who had learned to read a language older than words. "You don't stop it," he said, and the words settled into the boy's mind, not as a command, but as a fundamental truth. "You don't fight it. You give it the path it wants, but you make it walk, not run. You slow it down. You make it tired. You make it drop what it's carrying." That was the core principle. It was a simple, powerful truth about the land. It was the key. His father had never built the wall. The Great Depression had been followed by the war, and then his health had failed. He had never had the time, the strength, or the resources, but he had passed on the knowledge. He had laid the foundation in his son's mind. Silas ran his finger over his father's script in the old ledger. Below a detailed drawing of interlocking stones, his father had written a single line. "The rock is not the enemy. It is the tool." The book was the physical manifestation of that knowledge, a tangible link to the wisdom his father had spent a lifetime acquiring. It was a map, and Silas knew how to read it. He closed the ledger, placed it carefully back in a drawer, and felt a quiet, settled resolve. The men at the co-op could talk. The boy from the county could write his reports. They saw a problem to be solved with money and machines. He saw a system that needed to be persuaded back into balance. The next morning, before the sun had risen high enough to burn off the morning mist, Silas was at work. He did not go to the gully first. He went to the old machine shed. He opened the wide, creaking doors and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The air smelled of grease, old iron, and gasoline. He walked past the newer, bigger tractor he used for haying, a 1978 International Harvester that was reliable but lacked a soul. He went to the far corner, to the machine that was as much a part of the farm's history as he was. It was a 1953 Ford Jubilee, the commemorative model for the company's 50th anniversary. It was small, no bigger than a modern garden tractor, but it was made of thick, honest steel. Its gray and red paint was faded and chipped, but there was no rust on its working parts. His father had bought it new, and it had been the first tractor on their farm. Silas ran his hand over the cool metal of the fender. He checked the oil, which was clean. He checked the fuel. He climbed into the worn metal seat, the springs groaning under his weight. He pulled the choke, turned the key, and pressed the starter button on the transmission housing. The engine turned over twice, then caught with a puff of blue smoke and settled into a low, steady, familiar rhythm. It was a sound of patient, dependable power. This was the tool for the job. He backed the tractor out of the shed and attached the stone boat. It was a simple, brutal piece of equipment, a heavy sled made of thick oak planks bolted to steel runners. It was designed for one purpose: dragging rocks too heavy to lift. He drove the Jubilee, the stone boat rattling behind it, to the far end of the pasture, to a section of the field that had always been too rocky to plow properly. For generations, his family had fought these rocks, prying them out of the ground, cursing them, piling them along the fence lines in untidy heaps. Now, he would harvest them. He did not seek approval. He did not announce his intentions. He simply began. The work was quiet, methodical, and deeply physical. It was a conversation with the land, conducted not with words, but with leverage and labor. His first task was to prepare the foundation. He walked the line he had chosen, just back from the gully's edge, a gentle curve that followed the contour of the land. He used the front-end loader on the Jubilee to scrape away the thin layer of topsoil and grass, exposing the hard, red clay beneath. He did not want to build on the soft pasture soil. He wanted to build on the firmament. He dug deeper, by hand now, with a shovel and a pickaxe, until he hit the solid, unyielding layer of hardpan, the dense, compressed subsoil that water could not easily penetrate. This would be the footing for his wall. He cut the foundation trench 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, a shallow, curving smile on the face of the hill. Then came the gathering of the stones. This was the slowest part of the process, a patient harvest that took weeks. He drove the Jubilee through the rock-strewn field, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the shapes and sizes of the stones half buried in the earth. He was not just collecting rocks. He was selecting his materials, choosing each one for a specific purpose he already held in his mind. He learned the character of each stone as he fought it from the ground. Some were stubborn, locked in the earth's grip, requiring the full power of the tractor and a long iron pry bar to break them free. Others came easily, as if they had been waiting to be chosen. He loaded them onto the stone boat, 1 or 2 at a time for the largest boulders, a dozen at a time for the smaller, more manageable ones. He dragged them, scraping and groaning, across the field to the construction site. He sorted them into careful piles. There were the foundation stones, massive, blocky, and flat-sided, chosen for their weight and stability. There were the wall stones, smaller, more varied in shape, the bricks and mortar of his project. There were the chinking stones, small, angular fragments used to fill the gaps and lock the larger stones in place. And there were the capstones, long, flat slabs that would eventually cover the top of the wall. It was a slow, geological process of classification and organization. The community watched his strange, silent labor. Franklin Hayes would slow his truck as he drove by, shaking his head at the growing piles of rock. Dale Pritchard, working in his own field across the road, would sometimes stop his tractor and just stare, a look of bafflement on his face. The story of Silas and his rocks became a fixture of local conversation, a piece of rural folklore in the making. The consensus remained unchanged. It was a monumental waste of time, the grand folly of a man with nothing left to lose. Robert Jennings drove by once, on his way to inspect a new culvert on the state highway. He saw Silas on the old Jubilee, methodically moving a single large rock. He saw the neat piles, the carefully excavated trench. He didn't stop. To him, it was a sad, poignant spectacle. An old man building a useless monument to his own stubbornness, trying to hold back a flood with a handful of pebbles. He felt a pang of pity, but his report was already filed. The land was marginal. The case was closed. Silas was aware of the eyes on him, but they did not affect his work. His focus was on the task at hand, on the logic of stone and gravity. He began to lay the foundation. He rolled the largest, flattest stones into the trench, using pry bars and long wooden levers to nudge them into place. Each stone was a small battle of physics and will. He would seed it, test it for wobble, and then use smaller stones and hard-packed clay to lock it into a position of absolute stability. He was not just stacking rocks. He was weaving them together, creating an interlocking base that would distribute the immense weight of the wall above it. He worked from sunrise until noon, before the heat of the day became unbearable. He would eat a simple lunch in the shade of a large oak tree, then work again for a few hours in the late afternoon as the sun began to relent. His body ached. His hands were raw, despite his thick leather gloves. But there was a deep and quiet satisfaction in the work. He was not imposing his will on the land. He was listening to it, responding to its nature with the materials it had provided. As the foundation was completed, he began to build the wall itself. This was where his father's lessons became paramount. He did not build a straight, vertical face like a brick wall. He built it with a batter, a slight inward slope on both sides. This made the wall stronger, using the force of gravity to hold itself together. For every foot of height, the wall narrowed by an inch. The math did not require a pencil. It was in his hands, his eyes. He laid the stones in courses, always ensuring that the joints of one course were covered by the solid stones of the course above it. He followed the most important rule of dry stacking: one stone over two, two stones over one. He searched for the best face of each stone, the flattest, most stable surface, and placed it down. He looked for the natural contours, the small bumps and hollows, and found other stones that would fit against them, locking them together like pieces of a puzzle. Crucially, he did not seal the wall. He did not use mortar. He left small, intentional gaps between the stones. He was not building a dam to hold back a lake. He was building a filter, a sieve. The wall needed to breathe. It needed to let the water through, but slowly, reluctantly. This was the part that Jennings, with his talk of impermeable barriers, could never have understood. The wall's strength was not in its solidity, but in its permeability. Every few feet, he would place a through stone, a long, flat stone that spanned the entire width of the wall, from the front face to the back face. These stones acted like stitches, tying the two sides of the wall together, preventing it from splitting apart under pressure. He would find the perfect one, a long, narrow rectangle of granite, and spend an hour carefully working into place, a key locking the entire structure together. The wall grew, inch by inch, day by day. It rose from the red clay, a solid, patient curve of gray and brown stone. It was 4 feet wide at the base and would be 3 feet high when he was finished. It was not a massive structure, but it was dense, heavy, and intelligently built. It was a thing of substance. By late September, the wall was nearly complete. The days were growing shorter, the air crisper in the mornings. The long drought had not broken, but the sky had begun to change. The unforgiving white haze had been replaced by a deep, bruised blue and large, fast-moving clouds gathered in the west each afternoon. The signs were there. The rain was coming. Silas worked with a quiet urgency, placing the final course of stones, preparing to lay the capstones that would finish the job. He had built more than just a wall. Behind the wall, he had used the tractor's blade to create a broad, shallow basin, a slight depression in the pasture that fanned out over 2 acres. It was barely noticeable to the casual eye, a gentle dip in the land. This was the second part of the system. The wall would slow the water. The basin would hold it, giving it time to release its sediment, to drop its stolen soil before it seeped through the stones and continued on its way. On the first day of October, he placed the last capstone. The wall was finished. It stood 30 inches high and stretched for 200 feet, a low, graceful crescent of native stone guarding the head of the gully. It looked ancient and natural, as if it had been there for centuries. Silas stood back and looked at his work. He felt no pride, only a sense of rightness, of a task properly completed. He had done what his father had taught him to do. The rest was up to the rain. The rain began 2 days later. It did not come as a gentle shower. It came with a sudden, violent fury, as if the sky were tearing open. The first drops were fat and heavy, kicking up dust from the parched ground. Then, in an instant, it was a deluge. A solid sheet of gray water descended, so thick it seemed to suck the very air from the hollows. The sound on the tin roof of the farmhouse was not a patter. It was a deafening roar, the sound of a continuous explosion. Silas did not stay inside. He pulled on his old rubber boots and a worn canvas coat and walked out into the storm. The wind drove the rain sideways, stinging his face. Within seconds, he was soaked through, but he did not care. He walked to the rise of land and stood where he had stood so many times before, watching the gully. At first, the dry earth drank greedily, but it was quickly overwhelmed. The ground was too hard, the rain too intense. The water began to move. Small rivulets formed, merging into larger streams, all of them flowing down the slope, a web of silver threads on the brown land. They converged at the top of the pasture, forming a single, broad sheet of muddy water, heading directly for the gully. The water hit the shallow basin first. It spread out, slowing slightly, its energy dissipating over the wider area. Then it reached the wall, It pooled against the upstream face, the muddy water rising inch by inch. For a moment, it seemed Jennings had been right. It looked as if the water would simply pile up until it overtopped the wall and continued its destructive rush. But then, the wall began to work. Water found the gaps he had left. It began to seep through, not in a torrent, but in hundreds of small, controlled trickles. The sound was not the roar of a waterfall, but the gentle, steady gurgle of a mountain spring. The wall was breathing. It was taking the full, concentrated force of the flood and breaking it down into manageable streams. The water that emerged on the downstream side of the wall was different. It was still moving, but it had lost its frantic energy, and it was clearer. The wall was acting as a filter. The basin behind it was a settling pond. The fast-moving water, forced to slow down, was dropping its load of sediment, its precious cargo of topsoil. Silas watched for an hour as the storm raged. The water level behind the wall rose until it was halfway up the stones, but it went no higher. The system had found its equilibrium. The amount of water flowing in was matched by the amount seeping through. The gully below the wall was carrying water, yes, but it was a stream now, not a destructive torrent. It was flowing without scouring, without tearing at its banks. It was walking, not running. Miles away, Robert Jennings was in his county truck, his brow furrowed with worry. The storm was worse than the forecast had predicted. Reports of washed-out roads and flooded basements were crackling over his radio. He was on his way to check on the culvert near the state highway, a project he had personally overseen. His route took him down the county road that ran past Silas Blackwood's farm. As he approached, he slowed his truck, his mind already picturing the scene he expected to find. He imagined the little stone wall being torn apart, the rocks tossed about like pebbles, the gully deeper and wider than ever. It would be a final, dramatic confirmation of his own correct assessment. He rounded the final bend and stopped the truck in the middle of the road. He stared. The scene before him made no sense. It violated the principles he had learned from his textbooks. The pasture was awash with sheeting water. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets, but the gully, the great, ravenous gully, was tamed. He saw the broad, calm pool of water held behind the low stone wall. He saw the clear trickles emerging from the other side. He saw the controlled flow in the channel below. There was no roaring, no violent erosion. There was only the quiet, efficient functioning of a system he had dismissed as a fool's errand. He got out of the truck, oblivious to the soaking rain. He walked to the fence line and stood there, water dripping from his hair and running down his face. He watched the wall. It was not fighting the water. It was negotiating with it. It was a simple, elegant, and profoundly effective solution. He had come with spreadsheets and engineering formulas, and he had been wrong. An old man with a 50-year-old tractor and knowledge passed down from his father had been right. It was a moment of deep, silent, and humbling reevaluation. He stood there for a long time, the only sound the drumming of the rain and the gentle gurgle of water seeping through stone. The storm passed near dawn. The sun rose into a world washed clean. The air was cool and clear, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The ground was saturated, every ditch and hollow filled with water. Silas walked his land again in the morning light. The result was absolute and undeniable. His pasture was soaked, but it was whole. The topsoil was still there, a rich, dark brown. The grass was bent flat from the weight of the water, but its roots were still firmly in the ground. He walked down to the wall. It stood just as he had built it, unmoved, solid, its stones dark with moisture. Behind it, in the shallow basin, was the proof of its success. A new layer of earth had been deposited, a fan of rich, dark silt spreading out from the mouth of the draw. In the lowest part of the basin, the new soil was 6 inches deep. It was the topsoil from the upper slopes, the very earth that would have been washed down the gully, into the creek, and lost forever. The wall had not just saved the pasture, it had enriched it. He looked downstream, towards Franklin Hayes's property. The contrast was stark. The water that had left his land as a gentle stream had merged with runoff from other properties. A section of Franklin's fence was torn out, the posts leaning at crazy angles. A new, smaller gully had been cut across his tobacco patch, a miniature version of Silas's own, a fresh wound in the earth. The success could be quantified. Silas paced off the area of the new sediment deposit. It was nearly 2 acres. 6 inches of new topsoil over 2 acres. He did the math in his head. It was thousands of cubic feet of soil, hundreds of tons of the most fertile, valuable part of the land, captured and saved. His only cost had been his own labor, the fuel for the Jubilee, and the patience to do the job correctly. The county's proposed solution would have cost $40,000 and would have turned his pasture into a construction site for a year. Jennings had been wrong about the problem, wrong about the solution, and wrong about the cost. 3 days later, the county's Ford Ranger pulled into Silas's lane. It drove slowly, as if with hesitation, and parked near the barn. Robert Jennings got out. He was not wearing his crisp work shirt. He wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans. He was not carrying his clipboard. His hands were empty. He closed the truck door quietly and walked towards Silas, who was checking the tension on a strand of fence wire near the wall. Jennings stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. He looked at the wall, at the dark, rich soil behind it, and then at Silas. The young man's face, usually so full of confidence, was now a mixture of embarrassment and genuine curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice quiet. He cleared his throat. "I was wrong." The words came out plainly, without qualification. "I drove by during the storm. I saw it working. I came to ask if you'd be willing to tell me how you did it. How you knew." It was a direct admission of error, a humble request for knowledge. It was the apology of a man who had realized the limits of his own understanding. Silas stopped his work. He looked at the young man and saw not the arrogant official from a month before, but someone who was ready to learn. There was no gloating in Silas's posture, no triumph in his eyes. The vindication he felt was a quiet, internal thing, as solid and understated as the wall itself. He did not launch into a long speech. He simply nodded towards the wall. "My father taught me," he said. He walked over to the downstream face of the wall and pointed to one of the gaps between the stones, where a small trickle of water was still seeping through. "The water has to go somewhere. You can't stop it. You just persuade it to slow down. Make it drop what it's carrying." He explained the principle of the permeable structure. He showed Jennings how the batter gave the wall its strength, how the through stones tied it together. He kicked at the massive foundation stone, explaining that the wall's strength began deep in the ground. He picked up a handful of the new silt and let it run through his fingers. "This is the whole point," he said. "This was heading for the Chesapeake Bay. Now it's staying here, where it belongs." He took Jennings to the house and showed him the old ledger. He opened it to the page with his father's drawing, the sketch of the interlocking stones, the notes on the flow of water after a storm. Jennings stared at the page, at the careful, angular script, and saw that he was not looking at a farmer's diary. He was looking at a scientific document, a record of decades of careful observation and site-specific data. His own report, with its generic formulas and soil classifications, seemed flimsy and superficial in comparison. Jennings left that afternoon a different man. The experience had shaken his certainty, replacing it with a newfound respect for a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that was earned, not taught. He went back to his office and formally withdrew his initial report. In its place, he wrote a new one. It was a detailed, multi-page document that described Silas Blackwood's permeable stone check dam. He used terms like sediment capture and velocity dissipation, but the core of the report was a faithful description of Silas's method and his father's principle. He called it a low-cost, high-impact form of regenerative agriculture. He proposed that the county abandon its expensive, high-tech approach in favor of a pilot program based on the Blackwood Wall. He argued that the best solutions were often the ones that worked with nature, not against it, and that the deepest expertise was often found in the minds of the men who had worked the land for generations. His superiors were skeptical at first, but the photographic evidence, the stark contrast between Silas's pasture and his neighbors, was undeniable. The pilot program was approved. The knowledge was adopted. Robert Jennings began spending less time in his office and more time in the field, not as an expert telling farmers what to do, but as a student, listening to them, learning from them. Years passed. The wall endured. It settled into the landscape, becoming as much a part of the farm as the old oak tree on the hill. Moss and lichen grew in the crevices between the stones, their soft greens and grays softening the hard edges. Ferns took root in the small pockets of soil that collected on the ledges. It no longer looked like something that had been built, but like something that had grown there. It was a symbol of the timelessness and durability of true knowledge. The gully below the wall began to heal. The banks, no longer torn by violent floods, stabilized. Grasses and small shrubs began to grow, their roots knitting the soil together. The basin behind the wall grew richer every year, a fertile delta in the middle of the pasture. The Blackwood Wall became part of the local lore. It was no longer Silas's folly. It was a landmark. People would point it out as they drove by. "That's the wall that Old Man Blackwood built," they would say. Stopped the big wash cold. Other farmers, facing similar erosion problems on their own land, began to build smaller versions, copying Silas's design. The new normal in the county was no longer to surrender to the water, but to negotiate with it, using the patient logic of stone. One autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after the wall was built, Robert Jennings, now the senior agent for the entire region, brought a new recruit to the farm. Her name was Sarah, a young woman fresh out of the same university he had attended, her mind filled with the same textbooks and formulas. Silas, now in his late 70s but still lean and strong, met them at the fence. He had been expecting them. He led them not to the house for coffee, but directly to the wall. He walked along its capstones, his movements still sure and steady. He knelt down, just as his father had done, and pointed to the way the water had shaped the land around the structure. He explained the core principle, using the same simple, direct words his father had used with him. "You don't fight the water," he said to Sarah, who was listening with an intense, focused respect that Jennings had instilled in her. "You make it walk." He was passing the torch. He was planting the seed of knowledge in a new mind, ensuring it would not be lost. Jennings stood back, watching the exchange, a quiet satisfaction on his face. He was no longer the foil, the man of new systems. He had become a bridge, connecting the deep, generational wisdom of men like Silas to the institutional systems that so often ignored it. The stones did not care about progress. They only understood weight, water, and time. They had been in the fields for 10,000 years, waiting. The wall was not an invention, but a remembering. It was a quiet agreement made between a man and a mountain, a promise kept between a father and a son, to persuade the rain to be patient and to teach the land how to heal itself.